In this video, you will learn about food webs and how the interdependence of organisms works in a food web. So we'll see how when you take out or introduce an organism, you can see how it affects the ecosystem by analyzing the food web that you see. Unlike a food chain, a food web includes many of the organisms that interact in an ecosystem. Some can be very complicated, like this one, while others can be quite simple. While a food chain only tells you one animal that eats the producer, and then one animal that eats that one, and then so on and so on, a food web can tell you much more. We know, of course, that foxes don't only eat bunnies, but they also eat mice, fish, birds, as well as some fruits such as cherries, apples, and acorns. When we look at a food web, we can see that animals don't live on only one food. In this food web, we can see that the fox feeds on mice, birds, rabbits, and squirrels, though we could also draw a little arrow from the plants, because we know that foxes are omnivores. This just shows you that even though food webs are very complicated, they are not all inclusive. A good thing about food webs, though, is that they show us the interdependence of organisms in an ecosystem. If one organism is removed from the food web, the entire balance can be disrupted. We'll look at an example of that in just a few minutes. First, let's review some of the vocabulary you'll need to analyze a food web. The organisms that make their own food using photosynthesis are called producers. These are most often plants like fruits, vegetables, trees, and grass. The first level, or primary consumer, are the organisms that eat the producer. In this diagram, the first level consumer is the locust. The second level consumer, or the secondary consumer, is the consumer that actually eats the primary consumer. This is the lizard. And then in this food chain, the snake is the tertiary or third level consumer. He's the guy that eats the guy, that eats the guy, that eats the producer. Now, of course, this can go on because there are going to be some organisms that eat snakes or tertiary consumers. So this is very simplistic, but can go on for several more levels. To see how these organisms depend on one another, we can analyze what might happen if one organism was removed from the ecosystem. For example, if the fox is removed from this ecosystem, the rabbits, squirrels, mice, and birds lose one of their main predators, so their populations will all increase. If that happens, then they will overeat the grass and plants, which will start to die out. This causes a disruption for the herbivorous insects who also eat the plants, because the plants they eat will no longer be available. Then all the organisms that eat the herbivorous insects, like the predaceous insects, spiders, insectivorous birds, they will start to die out. And then the toads and the snakes as well, and so on and so forth. So you can see this entire ecosystem would be affected. This ecosystem would also be affected not only if we remove an organism, but if we introduce a new organism into the mix. The lynx, for example, is a predator of the fox. So if we introduce a lynx into this ecosystem, it would eat the fox. Because the fox had no predator before, the population of the fox will decrease. That means that rabbits, squirrels, mice, and seed-eating birds, and even these insectivorous birds, are going to increase in population because they have lost one of their major predators. Now, because of that, even though the insectivorous birds and all of these animals down here at the bottom do get eaten by other organisms, taking out the foxes is going to decrease the competition for the hawks and owls and the snakes. So the rabbits, squirrels, mice, and seed-eating birds, again, may start to overpopulate. And these insectivorous birds may start to overpopulate, eating more spiders, insects, and toads. The snakes won't have too much competition, and because they eat all of these other organisms, they could increase. So introducing an organism into the mix of an ecosystem that maybe doesn't belong there could very much disrupt the entire ecosystem. Hopefully this has helped you understand how to analyze a food web when you introduce or remove organisms from an ecosystem. Now you can go ahead and move on to answer the questions on your task sheet.